All rise. The head of the Congress is arriving.
Bitte setzen Sie sich.
Please be seated.
Ich erkläre die Auftaktsitzung des ersten Wochenendes der Wiener Kongresse hiermit für eröffnet. Zuallererst darf ich die Mitwirkenden dieses Wiener Kongresses vorstellen. Auf der linken Seite außen die Assistenz der Kongressleitung Marco Otoja, neben ihm der Kongressschreiber Michael Wurmützer, an meiner rechten Seite die Stellvertreterin der Kongressleitung Nun komme ich zur Jury, die sich wie folgt zusammensetzt. Jan Fleischhauer, Autor, Journalist, er arbeitete lange für den Spiegel und schreibt gegenwärtig für Fokus. Elisabeth Ornfeld, Literaturwissenschaftlerin und Autorin. Sie war Universitätsprofessorin für Anglistik an der Universität Zürich und ist seit 2007 Global Distinguished Professor an der New York University.
Amina Aziz is an author, a journalist, and editor-in-chief of Missy magazine in Germany. Monika Mukre is an author, activist, political scientist, and she is a member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. Thank you to all of you for coming. Vice Chair, would you please? Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The Madam Chair for today is Alexia Stuefer. She's a legal scholar. She is a criminal defense attorney. She is also an adjunct faculty at the Law School of the University of Vienna. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to ask Milo Rau for his introduction. Milo Rau is an author, a director, and since 2024 he has been the artistic director of the Vienna Festival. He's also a member of the Free Republic of Vienna, and he's also a co-signatory of the Vienna Declaration. Please, Milo Rau, you have 8 minutes. Thank you very much. Distinguished members of the Council of the Republic, head of Congress, distinguished members of the jury, public. This first Vienna Congress here in the Theater Accent is under the heading Cultural War. On the stage, you see a jury made of experts, including a member of the Council of the Republic. In the first rows, you have the other 20 members of our council. We have a head of the investigation who is an attorney heading up the Congress. And of course, we have you, audience. You will be able to pass your own judgment, as well as the audience following us in the live stream. Every argumentation that is expressed here will be subject to a 3-pronged truth test. It will be tested for its discursive truth by the jury, which has a very broad spectrum on expertise representing various opinions and perspectives. It will be subject to the test of its legal correctness by the head of the Congress. Here, she is representing criminal law and the Austrian Constitution, and the examination of its Republican utility by the Council of the Republic. They are representing the people of Vienna, the people who together with the team of the Free Republic of Vienna, will reflect on what republic is. This is the area that concerns all of us. What concerns all of us? Who decides what rules are to be used in this republic? Who has speaking time? Who is cancelled? What words are we going to use? Allow me to begin with an anecdote. Over 1 year ago, many of us, not far from here, were on the Judenplatz Square between the Holocaust commemorative statue and the statue of Gottfried Ephraim Lessing. The Israeli intellectual Omri Böhm had just finished his address to Europe under protest of all conservative media and part of the Jewish community of Vienna. And he had been talking about listening tolerance and the use of words like genocide, anti-Semitism, in light of the horrors that we here in Austria have the guilt to take upon. And he said, I hear you, but you hear me too. But when Böhms underscored this call, a woman approached me She asked me, why did you ask Annie Arnaud to be part of the Council of the Republic? She's an anti-Semite. Well, I asked her back, what is anti-Semitism? She answered, well, this is the call to exclude Jews from the society, to take their rights away, and then finally to kill them. And I asked her, did Annie Arnaud do this? Did she call for that to happen? When the woman said no, then I said, well, let's use a different word for that. And this is exactly what we're going to be doing in this Congress. We're going to be talking about how we use terms. In clarifying argumentation, we're going to be doing this politically and objectively by the jury and legally by the head of the Congress in a Republican manner. By examining the issue by the Council of the Republic from many perspectives of civil society. In the first case, we're going to be talking about the massacre in Gaza. Is it legitimate to talk about a genocide? Is this self-defense or is it revenge? This is a collateral damage, for example, when we're talking about Hamas murders, or we're talking about genocide, particularly when we're talking about 550,000 people. For example, is the term genocide necessary, for example, when we're talking about moral and political duties? Or is silence a passive complicity, particularly when we're talking about irredeemable suffering and unredeemable shared guilt, particularly now in Europe? Here we're talking about precision, or rather the restoration of precision, particularly when we're talking about the duty we have as a civil society that arises from this precision. We're talking about accepting that none of us have the whole truth, but we only have a part of the truth. But we cannot forget, when we're talking about the simplicity of terms, that things are complicated. They are diverse, multifaceted, and canceling oftentimes means creating space for voices that go unheard, to create discursive space for all persons that are tacitly or without comment have been canceled. Of course, we have to think about who decides who speaks and who doesn't, what topics, what opinions, what terms, what outrage is appropriate and which isn't. Who determines how we use our language? Because it seems to me that we're in an insane inversion of these terms, such as anti-Semitism, racism, defense of freedom, solidarity, or even staying true to the facts, both on the right and the left, as we will see. And this is not a means to honesty, openness, and tolerance, but rather intolerance and exclusion. In skittish nervousness, in white-hot anger, the theater of argumentative moral debate has become the theater of war, that people who think differently have become our enemies, and that if we speak to them, we are guilty by association, and that we are guilty of betrayal and conspiracy. However, dignity, harmony, and balance, as well as tolerant, moral, a subtle battle of arguments, what we call Republican virtues, has gone down in the storm of dogmatic attitudes, in extremes. This battle, this war, because that's what it is, a war. So war with, you have only one more minute, you have a war with victims and perpetrators. We're talking about people who are being fired, whose reputations are destroyed. For example, in the case of Gaza, and particularly here in Austria, there were 10,000 of them have lost their lives. In the next several days, we're going to be discussing all of these, fighting with each other in all toughness. The cultural wars we know from history, from the Roman Republic, as we know from the 30s, as well as from the United States, is the prequel to civil war, particularly autocracy. We often destroy the Republic when we believe we are defending it. The so-called culture war can also be different. It is a necessary dialectical debate that leads to a painful and shared solution. In the next several days, let us work toward this goal in all toughness and clarity, but also with generosity and curiosity. As Omri Böhm said last year on Judenplatz Square, I hear you, but can you hear me? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Please take your seat. Okay. In this Congress, we're going to be touching on very important areas of the freedom of opinion and their limits, particularly those that we see as a matter of course in liberal democracies and the rule of law. And we're going to be talking about if there is an area beyond the limits of the law and whether or not there are moral laws of what can be said. We're going to be taking a look at specific cases and arguments and opinions, and we're going to have them score off against each other, and we're going to make them come alive. And we're going to be taking a look at opinions, facts, and values that are perhaps polar opposites, or ones we think we're only polar opposites. We're going to be giving them internal and external space. We're going to tolerate them, stand them, we're going to respect them. We're going to find answers to these questions, what it means to have respect for opinions that we don't share. But this is the precondition for true dialogue, particularly that maybe other people might be right, as Hans-Georg Gadamer once so correctly stated. Before we get to the actual discussions of this Vienna Congress, I would like to ask Elisabeth Bromfriend to take the floor. She's going to be introducing us to the basic questions of the weekend. Culture wars, a short history of canceling, the freedom of opinion, and its limits. Please, you have 20 minutes for your statement. Thank you very much. Let us begin, because the history of canceling is so blinding. Let us begin with an attempt to clarify what we're talking about. The collective notions of prohibitions as a mirror of contemporary culture wars are part of the realm of censorship. This is something that is seen as undesirable or not permitted. This is to be held in check and surveilled. Here we have to distinguish between a competent state authority that exercises this control, banning and repressing language or actions on one hand, and on the other hand, a certain group in the public that is calling for this repression, is carrying it out. When we look at the word canceling as a subheading to censorship, then we see the following definition. I'm a linguist by nature. Decide not to conduct or perform something planned, usually without the expectation of conducting it at a later time. This means, in other words, an event is definitively cancelled. Somebody is uninvited, something is taken back. And this ties into the fear that something could happen once again. This is why the cancelling has to be as definitive as possible. Here we're talking about an action in the present which has an effect on a future situation, namely the absence of something. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary continues, as to the definition of cancelling, to annul or invalidate, to destroy the force, effectiveness, or validity of something, to bring to nothingness. So this is more than just postponing something to a predetermined later date. It's about destroying it. Something that has been is to be cancelled, to be destroyed. The value and the effect of something is to be eradicated. The idea of cancelling also entails a component of violence. A further precision is this eradication, particularly with regard to balance, to counterbalance, to match in force or effect, to offset, to neutralize strengths or effects. In cancelling, here we have a balance of power. Various pressure groups, of course, are trying to claim effectiveness and the power of interpretation. So in other words, they are canceling each other out. This eradication in the meaning of a neutralization means that both sides have the same weight in their power and their effect, or they have no weight. At the same time, the term cancel is also a material intervention. This also means to cross out with lines or other markings so as to invalidate for reuse. Here, you can imagine an invalidated bill that can no longer be used, and it is marked with lines or other types of marks, and thereby disfigured. This could be an official document, for example, or works of art, but also a way of performing art, where these types of interventions are aimed at eradicating, crossing out, eliminating some kind of predecessor. The idea is, of course, disfiguring as a gesture of invalidation. And then you have a definitional clarification: to mark or strike out for deletion. In this case, we're talking about editing out offensive passages in a text or in a visual performance. This means, in other words, canceling also has to do with a prohibition, crossing out or deleting, For example, a conscious turning away of something that was there and something is no longer permitted to be there. But does that work? Is it sustainable? I would like to quote a passage from Ingeborg Bachmann's Der Fall Franze. The narrator describes her visit to a temple of the Queen Hatshepsut, where every sign and trace of her was erased on the walls. It was thoroughly destroyed, but not by plunderers or archaeologists, but during her lifetime, or even after her death by Thutmosis III. Frances said to her companion, Martin, do you see? He forgot that those places where he'd erased her, that she has actually remained. You can read her because there's nothing where she is supposed to be. Bachmann's character says something that is to be eradicated remains with us after all because the act of erasing leaves traces behind. In canceling, this calls attention to something that what is no longer to be and leads us to the opposite, taking the fest. Cancel culture from the United States, of course, because cancel cultures come to us from the United States, it pays to take a brief look back to the post-war era. Senator McCarthy instigated a Red Scare by the state, which led to the infamous hearings in front of the Senate. An entire generation was suspected of having ties with the Communist Party, was affected by this culture war. Even Robert Oppenheimer. In the last several years, both sides have tried to speak or have attempted to speak of cultural McCarthyism, whether we're talking about the excesses of DEI regulations or the excesses that the banning of these regulations concerns. And here we're talking about a balance of power when we're talking about canceling. Historically, however, this has led to the opposite taking effect. For example, in the wake of the civil rights movement, for example, the requisite of political correctness. This is from the 1970s. This is a self-censorship, which entails an ironic position. I know that I would like to say something, but I also know that I shouldn't. So I'm accepting this prohibition because I find it to be politically correct and important. But it's about those that are marginally on the edges of culture to give them respect and consideration. And here, recalling Prada and Gucci, who used the blackface, for example. Why did they use it when it's seen by many people as offensive? But on the other hand, you could ask, should we even screen films that use blackface because they were used in a different cultural context? Here, this is a contradiction. In addition, we have the problem that what some believe as important self-censorship is unacceptable to others. Who decides what is correct, what is insulting, what is offensive, what is inappropriate? Does it make sense to erase history, particularly because it doesn't chime with our contemporary sensitivities? Or is this an unacceptable gesture toward the past and all of its injustices? For me, it's not about not wishing to concede to groups that haven't received the consideration that is their due. For example, when we're talking, this is what we see in right-wing cancel culture. But the idea is to provide them with this consideration. We know that radical art movements were aimed at dismantling these notions of what is appropriate, what is permitted. So they engaged in the breaking of taboos in public, and they wanted to point that out in their performance. When we look back in history, this also reminds us that as a counterpart of political correctness is the identity politics that we also know today as woke. This has less to do with ironic distance or self-censorship, but rather situational self-expression. I'm speaking as a woman, as a Jew, as somebody with a immigration background. Once again, this raises the question, who gets to speak for whom, about what is a good, bad cultural appropriation? Here we're talking about identity essentialism, because we assign the speaker, we pigeonhole them in a particular position. And this entails interweaving subjectivities and internal contradictions and dissonances. With this cultural predecessors from the second half of the 20th century, we can take a look at our contemporary cancel culture today. And we're talking about a public act, particularly when it comes to art, culture, education, and of course on social media. We're talking about erasing something for the unforeseeable future, something we don't believe is acceptable today. In our extreme diverse and globally integrated culture, however, the question is raised about who gets to decide about what is societally acceptable, socially acceptable. And of course, this question is raised with particular urgency. Canceling is not just a legal discussion. And of course, in the next several days, we will come back to that notion, but it has to do with sensitivities of how we see ourselves and certain concepts about the society and how society grapples with these intellectual and aesthetic products. On both sides, left and right, the criticism of this process has been laser focused on anecdotes, individual cases. For example, when it comes to wearing dreadlocks, the N-word, the canon of dead white men, for example, and woke authors, female authors on the other. And because we're talking about anecdotes, it's worth examining these cases individually. We have to bear in mind that sometimes we don't have all of the facts in order to pass judgment. In our post-truth world, we see a blurring of the lines between expert knowledge and unfounded opinion. Cancel culture thrives against the backdrop of the fact that assertions can no longer be verified, or it doesn't even matter whether something is true or we're talking about an alternative fact, something that is deliberately spun up. For example, J.D. Vance in talking about Haitians eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. Yes, okay, you can laugh now. The prohibition is conjured up and circulated by those who claim that a statement, an action, or an event is hurting their feelings. So we're talking about sensibilities, once again, a perception in which opinion focuses on what is insulting. This is an enlargement of what we talked about, censorship, and something that is morally offensive or something that was declared as politically unacceptable. In short, canceling is part of our contemporary culture, our wound culture, where we talk about our own vulnerability and use that as a benchmark. But also what Eva Illus called victim culture, because victimhood is a form of power. In other words, canceling fits with or jibes with the new sensibility of the early 21st century. The statement that triggers me or that insults me blurs the lines between what is generally valid, universal laws, or personal individual states of emotion. However, it's important to differentiate between these statements. For example, something that can be called defamation on one side, or one that is a premeditated incitement to violence. Of course, this is a very decisive differentiation to make. However, I would like to highlight that the tendency to boycott, for example, that is called for in the context of cancel culture has to do with a currency that George Frank several years ago called the attention economy. Attention is a form of currency, and today it is precious and valuable. Because we have so little of it, various people are putting demands on our attention. It's not just a symbolic, but rather a monetary question. When we're talking about canceling, we're talking about a two-pronged focusing of attention. The public focus, here we have one's own indignation, the appreciation, and we have an appreciation of our own personal value when we claim the right to decide what is allowed and what is not permitted. This is financial and symbolic, of course, and where we can benefit and profit from the attention of others, and to whom this value is to be denied. But we also focus on those from whom this attention is to be withdrawn. So those who are cancelled can, for their part, use this indignation themselves, and they can accuse those of withdrawing consideration for them of doing this, and they can create their own platform by doing this. Here you have mutual recriminations at play, and the players are focused on this. And of course, this often distracts them from the key issue at hand. The opposite of canceling is the insistence on the right to freedom of speech. In a democratic world, this means that you have to tolerate speech or even defend speech that you don't ascribe to or you don't even like. This has to do with tolerating difficult differences of opinion, of internal antagonisms. Even if this entails the wish of countering this with a firm stance of one's own. In the interest of its synthesis, I would like to introduce a further position, which is, of course, why we're here at this event. Here we're talking about civility. This is old-fashioned decency, one could say. When we're talking about imposing prohibitions on each other, we're talking about a spiral of discourse turned inward on itself. Here, an unpopular opinion is invalidated and ridiculed, and this takes us to a discursive dead end. In public debate, this was essential for public democracy. My proposal would be to tolerate this antagonism with a healthy helping of self-reflection. As Sheila Ben Habib states in the lectures that she holds here in Vienna in this Institute for Human Sciences, it may be presumptuous to think in place of others. However, she says that the consideration of others' opinion is a genuine encounter with others as interlocutors in the interest of coexisting in this world. As a cognitive image, she proposes, and I think this is really very appropriate, the world is like a table. This is what she says, where we sit. And we sit around this table, and it unites and separates us. Instead of deleting and crossing out, it gives us the opportunity to listen and to offer pushback. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to you. I now hand over to my deputy, who is now going to explain the schedule for the conference this weekend. Thank you very much. In addition to today's opening session, 3 additional sessions will take place during this Congress weekend until the closing session on Sunday afternoon. This is not a trial, but a Congress that strives to raise fundamental questions and also attempts to get to the bottom of them. This discussion and debate will take place on the basis of case examples. Like any other setting, the investigation, or rather examination of witnesses of the Congress requires rules of procedure, and the Congress hereby adopts the following rules. We ask all participants to comply with them. The Congress will follow a 2-stage procedure. The Free Republic has appointed us, this Congress, which is to say us, the participants, the jury, and the Council of the Republic, to use 3 specific cases in a public hearing or inquiry to arrive at conclusions regarding fundamental questions. The sessions will begin with a brief introduction of the witnesses who will be heard, who will then be questioned by the Congress chair and the jury. The following principles will guide the proceedings of the Congress: the principle of public access, the principle of oral proceedings, the principle of immediacy, the principle of hearing being heard, the principle of equal speaking time. After the interviews have been completed, the jury will vote on the key questions in a consultation on Sunday, following a summary by each jury member. The conference chair and I, her deputy, will attend this consultation. The jury will then announce its decision, which will be taken by a simple majority of the votes cast. Any dissenting opinions may be expressed by the members of the jury in a personal statement. The jury will make recommendations in the form of resolutions on the cases that have been discussed, and the Council will take decisions of a more general and thus more generalizable, if you will, nature. The following questions may serve as a basis for the general conclusions of the Council of the Republic at the end of the Congress, that is. Now, Can anyone speak at the Vienna Festival's discussion events, provided that they have not already broken the law, or are they not likely to do so? Yes, no, abstain. Should people who express views that others may find derogatory or threatening be cancelled, even if they have not yet crossed the legal line? Yes, no, abstain. Does the call for cancelling on moral grounds open the door to an unstoppable chain reaction, or, in other words, are the limits of freedom of speech and expression too narrow? Yes, no, abstain. Now, the representatives of the Council will decide on these key questions at the end of the Congress in an open vote by a show of hands. The first Vienna Congress is entitled Culture Wars. Now, one might consider it rather exaggerated to describe bitter disputes and controversies as wars when bloody battles raging not far from us are claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. But it has become commonplace, both in our part of the world and also in Anglo-American countries, to describe polarizing passions, identities, worldviews, in other words, political emotions, as culture wars. Against this backdrop, we're going to discuss the limits to freedom of expression using the example of cancelling. We will therefore explore the question: who's allowed to say, write, sing, paint, or think what, when, and where? We will clarify the term and its relationship to freedom of expression. Thus, the call for an absolute understanding of freedom of expression merely support the prevailing conditions and cement power imbalances, or thus cancelling open up space for previously suppressed views of dominant positions and opinions? Or does it even narrow the discourse through its potential for outrage and scandalization? Now, the legal aspects, the legal situation, and the individual cases we intend to address will be introduced by the chair in a minute. So, this is how we're going to approach. As already explained, the three cases will be discussed after a short introduction of the topic based on interviews with witnesses. These interviews with the witnesses will proceed as follows. First, in the first 10 minutes, the conference chair will outline the case and remind the jury of the questions. 2. This is followed by interviews with the witnesses by the conference chair and the jury, each lasting 20 minutes. 3. For 5 minutes, basic questions will be clarified. So, general questions about the person, their role in the Congress, and so on. And 4, the following 15 minutes are set aside for questions by the jury. 5, afterwards, the Council of the Republic has the opportunity to ask questions. At the end of the interview, one member of the jury will summarize the statements. So, as you can see, the conference program is ambitious, which is why we attach great importance to adhering to the schedule, and this will be enforced by our chair. I would also like to ask you to treat each other with respect and restraint. This also applies, of course, to the audience. I would now like to ask the conference chair to outline the issues that will be addressed over the next 3 days. The topic that the Free Republic has asked us to investigate and elaborate on is entitled Culture Wars. It is a title that I did not really like originally, but even in the Free Republic of Vienna, we have to live with certain facts. The Free Republic of Vienna, let us know what it meant by culture wars, the polarization, the increasing bitterness of political movements, political emotions that are deeply moving. This refers to what used to be called Kulturkampf, in other words, religious conflicts and conflicts between a secular culture and the churches. We, as the Congress Bureau, ask ourselves, has that time come again? Has it ever been any different? Now, the term Kulturkampf not only contains the word fight, but also the word culture. The use of this term, as the Free Republic told us, is often associated with the assertion that the passionate, bitter conflicts have shifted to culture or cultural, even lifestyle-related identity issues. Quote, instead of disputes about social legislation, disputes about gender, eating habits, or car drive systems, end of quote. Now, the question of the cancel culture, which we have also been asked to investigate, is closely linked to this. Now, the Republic thinks it is remarkable that the question now arises as to whether cancel culture exists in the first place, or that this is controversial, because there seem to be authors who vehemently deny this, while others insist that there is an increasing pressure to conform due to the structure of our discourses and debates, and that one must be afraid to come up with an opinion if it deviates, for example, from a so-called social mainstream or from the prevailing opinions, quote, in one's own social circus, end quote. The Free Republic of Vienna does not think this is the case at all, but sent us the following quote by George Orwell, quote, a modern literary intellectual lives and works in a state of constant anxiety. Not so much with regard to public opinion in the wider sense as to the prevailing opinion within his or her own group, end quote. In this sense, the Free Republic of Vienna is looking at the current reality and recognizes in it a form of co-evolution of polarization, political emotionality, and legal norms. It is almost a paradox that in public debates, in other words, in the aforementioned cultural wars, it is often claimed that there is a left-wing cancel culture, while there is little or no talk of a right-wing cancel culture, even though the latter is currently establishing itself successfully. For the first time in history, we are seeing authoritarianism in the US. Most recently, President Trump banned Harvard University from accepting students from abroad unless the university meets his demands. He said the public statements made by students on social media had to be verified. Harvard, of course, knows how to defend itself in court, but what if he and his followers simply ignore the court's ruling and literally they do not give a damn about those rulings? And given the current circumstances, we can even ask ourselves, does the Supreme Court have his back? Now, conclusion drawn by the Free Republic of Vienna. In the US, the right cancels the left. In Hungary and Slovakia, the right cancels critical art. And in Austria? Well, the FPO's election manifesto for the 2024 parliamentary election is unequivocal when it calls for the abolition of woke cultural events, namely the Eurovision Song Contest and the Vienna Festival. No Free Republic of Vienna if the FPO had its way. An impressive example is provided by the early 1970s when the Marxist economist Ernest Mandl was appointed to the Free University of Berlin, but was prevented from entering Germany by the government led by the SPD and FDP. The then Foreign Minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, put it like this: the decision was not aimed at the Marxist scientist Mandl. Rather, it was aimed at the revolutionary Mandl. Well, thank you at this point to the Free Republic. The example could not be more fitting and gives us an ideal transition to a brief excursion into the world of norms, statutory law, the Constitution as a point of reference, not only for our discussion, but for our current existence. We quickly understand that the discourse not only touches on the fundamental right of freedom of opinion, but also on the fundamental right to academic freedom, artistic freedom, the freedom to carry out a business. They are all stakeholders in the liberal constitutional order, our basic order, that is, and together they all form the so-called liberal basic principle of the Austrian constitution. They shape Austria. And to change them would mean a complete amendment of our constitution, which would require a two-thirds majority in the National Council and the Federal Council, and also a referendum. In Austria, fundamental rights are even enshrined several times in the Constitution. In other words, they come at the highest level of the legal system. Freedom of expression is enshrined in Section 13 of the Basic Law, in force since 1867, and also in Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, in force since 1958. The freedom of science is enshrined in Section 17 of the Basic Law, the freedom of art in Section 17A of the Basic Law, and in each case in the ECHR. And fundamental rights are also enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Other milestones are the legal acts of the United Nations, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, both dating back to 1948. The fundamental rights I've mentioned are central freedoms of a constitutional democracy. They are conceived as defensive rights against state power and also arbitrariness, and they are originally directed against surveillance, indoctrination, and propaganda by the government. Freedom of expression, for example, protects us against censorship, but not against criticism. Furthermore, fundamental rights obligate the state to create the basis for the exercise of fundamental rights. In other words, to ensure the conditions for media diversity, higher education and art, etc. However, fundamental rights do not apply without limits. Encroachments on fundamental rights are justified under constitutional law, also within the jurisdiction of the Free Republic of Vienna, if they are deemed necessary in a democratic society. So, this brings us to the cases that we have been asked to investigate. The first case on Saturday morning will be presented by the Free Republic of Vienna in its usual exaggerated manner as follows: freedom of expression or incitement to hatred, cancelling polarization, and freedom of speech in the face of the war in Gaza. One side deplores the intolerable anti-Semitic slogans in the debate. The other side the defamation and suppression of voices that oppose the war in Gaza, without even mentioning the terrible attack by the fundamental Islamist terrorist group Hamas. Some speak of genocide, an originally legal term with clear contours, while others are outraged that even the use of this term in this context is Israel-related anti-Semitism or encourages it. But the Free Republic of Vienna wonders whether this does not already constitute the legal offense of incitement to hatred. And furthermore, is not the fundamental right of freedom of assembly affected when so-called pro-demonstrations are broken up or banned? What exactly does international humanitarian law and the international law of war actually provide for? Where and to whom do they apply? All these questions need to be clarified before half-truths and a rabid focus on politics, as we've already mentioned, a complicated relationship between the law, political emotions and passions, and ultimately this will lead to fatal misunderstandings. Now, the Free Republic of Vienna's key questions for the jury are therefore: 1. Are genocide and attempted genocide permissible terms for the actions of the Israeli armed forces in Gaza, or is even the use of the terms propagandistic and anti-Semitic? 2. Is speaking about Israel, Palestine, and Gaza subject to political constraints, including those imposed by governments that restrict freedom of expression in a way that violates fundamental rights? 3. Are Austria and Germany, as perpetrator countries, supposed to be particularly vigilant in their dealings with Israel when it comes to anti-Semitic aspects of criticism of Israel's government policy, which is why voices from the boycott campaign, such as BDS and other similar positions, should not be tolerated, at least not in publicly funded art institutions. The second case that we're going to hear on Sunday afternoon focuses on political activism and the rules of academic work. It is called the case Ulrike Gero, cancelled by the left. The University of Bonn terminated the employment contract of Ulrike Gero, a political scientist, for allegedly violating standards of academic work. But she herself is convinced that this is only a pretext to get rid of her, simply because she is unpopular. Now, the Free Republic of Vienna's key questions for the jury are: Question 1. Are publicly expressed opinions of professors and academic staff as employees of a university, no matter how much criticism these opinions receive, grounds for termination and/or dismissal? Question number 2. Did Ulrike Gero intentionally or negligently use facts incorrectly to support a political position? Question 2b. Did Ulrike Gero engage in pro-Russian propaganda? Question 3. Did anybody do her wrong? Now, the last case we're going to hear on Sunday afternoon deals with the topic of attacks on artistic freedom in Eastern Europe, cancelled by the right. As geographically close as Hungary and Slovakia are, the rest of the world seems to care little about the constant striking encroachments on fundamental rights. As a result, there is no public outcry when politically unpopular leaders are removed from art and cultural institutions. The jury will discuss the following key questions after the hearings. Question number 1. Are dismissals of left-wing and liberal artists and artistic directors, for example, and their replacement by artists with ties to the government and who strengthen national consciousness, an encroachment on artistic freedom? Second question, does the government, the state, have the right to participate in the selection of artistic directors, etc., due to its financing of art and cultural institutions, which is why the change in artistic leadership positions as a result of a change of government, for example, is this legitimate? Question number 3, the European Union has no competence in matters of cultural policy. This is a responsibility left to the individual member state. Now, is a European Culture Freedom Act necessary to protect artists in the member states against authoritarian threats? Now, during those investigations, We're going to follow the model of the Agon, which is the peaceful exchange of arguments, views, and ideas that is thought to have taken place in antiquity. During the interviews with the witnesses, the facts of the case will become visible and tangible before your ears and eyes in all their opposing elements. Now, for its part, the Congress management, the Bureau, invited Antigone, in spirit that is, and we asked ourselves the important questions of the prevailing order in the face of violence that cannot be tamed. The Free Republic of Vienna has the last word once again, and it comes up with a smart quote. It is Article 5 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of August 1789. Quote, "Only the law has the right to prohibit actions that are harmful to society. Anything that is not forbidden by law cannot be prevented, and no one can be forced to do what the law does not command." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please take your seat again. Now we come to the concluding speeches of this opening session. They're going to be illustrating, staking out the questions of this Congress, namely the necessity or the danger of cancel culture. Is cancel culture politically or morally necessary, or even calls for the so-called culprit to be fired, especially when we're talking about political emotions of our cultural wars today. And of course, we will be able to tolerate these during the discussions as well. Matija Medved, I would like to ask you to come and take the floor. Matija Medved was born in Yugoslavia and has been living in Germany since 1992. She's an actress, author, director. In 2024, she met enthusiastic audiences with her performance of Festwochen gegen Raubtierkapitalismus. She sees herself as a ghetto-lectural artist. Please. For thousands of years, patriarchy has canceled the rights of women, minorities, and vulnerable groups, the queer community, animals, and nature. It has to because this is the only way, this is the only way that patriarchy can stay alive. The problem with patriarchy begins with Jesus. When Jesus died, his body left no nutrients for the earth, but went up to heaven and disappeared into thin air. In the same way, patriarchy leaves nothing fruitful for posterity and even prevents progress, from which a political, intersectional, queer feminist perspective is not economic growth, but sustainability and equality. Bell Hooks describes the patriarchy not as a single man, but as, and I quote, "a political social system that insists that men are inherently dominant, superior to anything and anyone considered weak, especially women, and that they have the right to dominate and rule over the weak and maintain this dominance through various forms of psychological terrorism and violence." End quote. The first victims of patriarchy are not women, but young boys who are indoctrinated from an early age with hegemonic masculinity based on dominance, power consciousness, loneliness, anger, strength, repression of their own emotions, overconfidence, technology-oriented, and inheritance and maintenance of a pyramid-shaped power structure in a patriarchic world. Men who have these characteristics and world views are considered less masculine, less alpha, so that these men are placed at the bottom of the power pyramid. And this way of thinking reinforces the heteronormative and binary gender image, which also has a clear vision for women. In the past, it was exclusively that of the servant and subordinate to man in order to be considered a good and acceptable woman in society. Women had to perform work for men free of charge, which usually took place within their own four walls at home, consisted of cooking, housework, childcare, and producing offspring, while men took care of everything outside the four walls, outside of the home, and received money for it. Of course, women were to be sexually available, which is why marital rape has only been punishable by law in Germany since 1997. For example, although there were 138 votes against passing this law at the time, this is when women's rights were cancelled. And all of these no votes came exclusively from the conservative and patriarchal corner of the CSU, CDU, and the FDP, including Friedrich Merz, that idiot. I don't have that much time, so please let me continue. The role of women was broken down more and more by the increasingly popular feminism and the hippie movement, but we have still not been able to achieve the same rights and the same security and safety in all areas of life as men, because our needs and even our lives are continually being cancelled. 2,300 women are killed by their partners or ex-partners every year in the EU, and 1.8 million women are raped by men, with only 0.5% of cases resulting in a conviction. The number of unreported cases is estimated to be much higher. Women must be controlled and kept down in conservative societies to ensure the comfort and ease of male domination. But the patriarchy is not only fighting against feminism. The destruction of the environment, misogyny, xenophobia, queerphobia are the products of patriarchy, which is inextricably linked to white supremacy. The top 10 richest people in the world are exclusively white hetero men, who basically dominate this Forbes 2024 list. These are also the 1% of humanity who emit as much CO2 as half of the world's population, even though they have the power to fight this climate crisis, but instead they contribute to the destruction of this earth. The richest men in the world are canceling science and destroying the earth for their own profits and power, while sending phallic rockets into space to search for newer planets to colonize, exploit, and dominate. The patriarchy must always grow and expand, and this egomaniacal and ruthless lifestyle costs energy. 125 billionaires consume as much CO2 as the whole of France. The patriarchal alpha pyramid also ensures that it stays that way by attacking and canceling anyone who has different ways of thinking and models of life. Even scientists who have been drawing attention to the climate crisis for over 40 years. I repeat, 40 years. In 2018, political scientist Carol Deggett used the term petromasculinity, which links white hegemonic masculinity with an adherence to fossil fuels, climate change denial, and authoritarianism. Deggett uses the phenomenon of Donald Trump and his rise as an example of petromasculinity. In an increasingly diverse and feminist world, patriarchal men feel threatened in their dominance, and white men in particular could easily be tempted to tie their hegemonic masculinity and cultural identity to fossil fuels and vehicles. And it is precisely these values of traditional masculinity and the glorification of fossil fuels that Donald Trump embodied in his election campaign. His rise could therefore be seen as a counter-movement to equality and sustainability. Also, for Trump and his supporters, fossil fuels are a big part of the power that they have, as fossil fuels are still an important part of the United States' success. The U.S. economy is the largest in the world and cannot function without oil and gas. 80% of America's energy comes from fossil fuels. These resources support millions of jobs in the United States, and these jobs help make energy affordable for all Americans. Fossil fuels have long been used by the white patriarchy to maintain power and independence, and when these symbols of masculinity and power are challenged because of the environment, the patriarchy feels attacked and usually responds with even more hegemonic masculinity to counter and demonstrate its own power, such as the case of Andrew Tate. The rapist and human trafficker tried to diss Greta Thunberg on X by bragging about his 33 cars, which have very high emission footprints. He puts his masculinity, dominance, and hubris in relation to the amount of damage he is doing to the planet. His masculinity is confirmed in his patriarchal cosmos by his environmentally unfriendly cars. However, toxic masculinity is not only marked by owning these cars, by also an egomaniacal driving style. Every time I have passed someone on the highway legally, I had someone flashing their headlights from me from behind. There was always a man behind the wheel who was probably trying to compensate for his hair loss with his driving style. Of course, it is not surprising that the conservative parties, AfD, CDU, and the FDP have canceled the speed limit on the highway. Here, the car industry and the so-called freedom over safety on the highway and environmental protection is what we're talking about. If you drive faster, you only reach your destination a few minutes earlier, but a speed limit would save up to 2 million tons of CO2 per year. Car tire abrasion would also decrease, from which 100,000 tons per year, according to the Fraunhofer Institute, accounts for 1/3 of primary microplastic emissions in Germany. This makes tire abrasion the largest source of emissions in Germany. However, toxic masculinity perceives a speed limit as a restriction of its own hyper-individuality, whose urge correlates with the obsession for freedom and to move up the alpha pyramid. The fact that the environment continues to be destroyed for this male freedom is ignored. The patriarchy not only cancels out others, but also some areas of its own brain that have to do with empathy and intelligence, which is why it also has difficulties thinking ahead, sustainably and outside its own radius, outside the box, so to speak. People who only revolve around themselves lose their mirror neurons and are unable to build deep bonds in relationships. Bro culture can only cooperate or enter into alliances with women who have internalized patriarchy and who subordinate themselves to this structure in order to become part of a privileged group and gain better access to resources and contacts. Women, for example, who protect or even defend Me Too men, women who continue to work with toxic men because it could be beneficial for their own careers, women who do not support other women, marginalized groups, etc., women who think in a fundamentally liberal way, women who cancel feminism and also mean those who are the co-conspirators of the patriarchy, and they're part of the problem. They confuse success with intelligence and talents. They don't see at all that they are given preferential treatment and pushed by a system that keeps women down and hates empowered feminists at the same time. However, patriarchy not only has a bossy relationship with empowered feminists, but also with the environment. Former Brazilian President Bolsonaro, who, like his colleague Trump, has repeatedly made anti-queer misogynist statements, has attacked minorities. He considers the Amazon to be, quote, a virgin that every pervert from the outside longs for, unquote. And it is used for agriculture, mining, infrastructure projects and should be exploited. For Bolsonaro, nature is just another woman to be dominated and exploited. But patriarchy sometimes also comes across as a wolf in sheep's clothing, especially neoliberalism, which is all about profit. Neoliberalism cancels by capturing, dominating, and profiting from isms in social movements, woke-washing, greenwashing, pink-washing, etc. The Silicon Valley cowboys, Bezos, etc., are practicing an modern masculinity that serves as a savior in turbulent climate crisis times, which is nothing other than a patriarchal response to climate action. Kara Daggett writes, Patriarchal-masculinity pays homage to fossil fuels and authoritarian men, while eco-modern masculinity pays homage to a green future and liberalism. Both share misogynistic views. Both view the more-than-human world as something to be controlled. Both idolize infinite growth of profits and energy as sacrosanct. At a time when more and more people are organizing climate strikes and fighting for equality, the patriarchy must transform itself in order to stay alive. New social movements that question existing norms, an ever-increasing number of people who stand up for the climate and equal rights are not only cancelled frontally, as Trump, Bolsonaro, Tate, and co. do, but also destroyed from within by being infiltrated, as Brandon Darby did in 2008, for example. He was one of the leading voices of a left-wing self-organized group, and at the same time he worked for the FBI as a mole. Darby, who was active in several left-wing organizations, was not only an informant, he also caused conflicts in all organizations and destroyed them from the inside. In a patriarchal world, which is much more difficult for left-wing movements anyway, because white privileged men are gaining more and more space. Statistically, they are always navigate to leadership positions more than other participants in the group. One of the means to do this is, for example, exclusive talking. They select individual people or small groups of people to talk to about things. Other tools are that they create hierarchies. They devalue the consensus of the group. They consolidate. You have 1 more minute. They consolidate their power by only giving a small part of the power to few. They are not transparent and promise things on the fly. They decide impulsively. They establish hierarchies for so-called experts in their group, and those who are in leading positions are mostly white, heteronormative, middle class, and mostly male. The society we live in cancels everything that attacks the patriarchy in all places and all areas of life. The destruction of the environment, misogyny, xenophobia, queerphobia, the productions of patriarchy, which can only survive by killing, subjugating, exploiting, excluding, occupying, and drawing boundaries in society and on earth. Queer feminism, on the other hand, is sustainable and can only be survived by creating life, building communities, sharing, inspiring, opening itself to others. This is why patriarchy will do everything in its power to cancel feminist demands, because the respective demands of both parties are diametrically opposed. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, let us castrate the patriarchy. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mattea Medet, for your introductory words. I would like to ask Ulf Poschardt to come up to the stage for his introductory speech. Ulf Poschardt is a journalist. He was the editor-in-chief of the magazine of the Süddeutsche Magazin, later from Vanity Fair. He is the editor-in-chief of the Welt, and he is now the editor of Welt for the Axel Springer. And with his text, Shitbürgertum, he caused quite a stir. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I have written a text, but I think I have to address two things that Milo Rau touched on today. The badge says the Republic of Love. On the 7th of October, 2023, 3,043 people were raped, murdered, burned, shot, kidnapped in a brutal way. And here, as we often have here in Germany in our cultural operations, it is up to us to talk about this. Here we have this Swiss son of a doctor here. We don't say anything about Assad or the Taliban. We never say a word about that. And then all of a sudden, here we have the Republic of Love written on our chests. Here we're talking about BDS. This is about boycotting Israel. And we know that if we boycott Israel, it will be destroyed. So, on that note, this has nothing to do with my speech, but this is something that I have to get off my chest. And when I see what we're going to be talking about tomorrow, I would like to dedicate my speech to the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, because at the end of the day, it is up to all Israelis and Jewish people. Please do not interrupt the speaker. They have to counter anti-Semitism with the violence of weapons, especially here in Germany, in our cultural scene, where there's great ignorance. I agree much more with Benjamin Netanyahu than Milo Rau. Please do not interrupt the speaker. Please, Mr. Poschardt, please continue. I had to get that off my chest. Thank you very much. Actually, so when we're talking about cancel culture, you just imagine if Hamas were to come in here and none of you would survive. And then you could ask yourself the question if whether or not your protest would be interesting to anybody, because Israel, of course, is living on the border of the Gaza Strip. But here, I'm here with a happy message. I'm very happy to be here, in fact. I'm actually superfluous because Robert Williker, last time, gave a really fantastic speech. Every sentence, every word, everything was absolutely perfect. When I read it again, I think nothing has changed since then. And Williker gave that speech in the spirit of constructive criticism. And I think that is nonsense. I don't believe in cancel culture. For me, cancel culture is just a means of generating business. Thank you very much to Elisabeth for talking about Frank and his economy of attention. But for me, this was actually quite a lucky happenstance in Germany when we had cancel culture, particularly when we're talking about the previous speaker. Please do not call out from the audience. Who said that? Would you please stand up? They left. Okay, fine. So this is how I see the business of culture. Of course, I'm against the culture war and the culture struggle or fighting. And all of the friends here, friends of Hamas and Queers for Palestine, for example, all of you would have been killed and shot in Rafah. You would have been dragged through Rafah with pickup trucks. for everything that you say and think. You can, of course, say and do whatever you want, but not with tax money. Culture wars. I couldn't care less. I would like to thank all of you, in fact. Please continue doing what you're doing. Please do not call out from the audience. As a Congress, we have the rules of procedure that the people who have the floor are allowed to speak. We will ask you to respect that. Is that possible? Well, it's wonderful, actually, because this actually confirms my hypothesis. I would like to thank all of your idols, Jan Böhmermann, primarily. Jan Böhmermann has quoted me at least a dozen times in his program, and as soon as Jan Böhmermann gave me a Hitler mustache, this was a wonderful moment for me when he put that picture of me up on the screen, because you're free after that to do whatever you want. What else is there? Stalin? Where else can you go? I would ask you once again, please respect our rules of procedure, Mr. Borchardt. So here you are saying two things. This is a liberal. I ask you, please don't call out. So we have a liberal order where you can say something that you don't like. And this is something I'm telling you don't like it. It's to burst your bubble. And this is exactly what these debates are set up to do. You are put up on posters, wanted posters. You can criticize the AfD as much as you want. You are considered AfD-like. And you have a ritualized denunciation competition that has been established. Then you are called right-wing, and then extremist, and then even Nazi. I think the Shitbürger is not something on the left. These are not people who like to crap on everybody. But the leftist idea about criticism is a dialectical process, and this embodies progress. But this is not what's happening, because on the left, you have morals. It's not reading anymore. It's getting its information from YouTube videos. And basically, and it is actually created a black and white view of the world, in the decent and the indecent, in black and white. And here you have any kind of debate that has become, all debate has become superfluous. So we have nothing more to offer. We, the liberals, the libertarians, and when I think about Jan, of course, we have other people who are true conservatives. We cannot compete with you. We have no opportunity at all to break through. The cultural dominance that you have gained, or have even cheated your way to with tax money, has a fantastic hegemony it has created. And I think it has to continue on as it has. Somebody like Claudia Roth is fantastic. Andreas Görgen, for example. And I see where we have the problem that we are promoting culture that is close to the interests of the government. I'm only here for one day, but I would like to remind you that it is really worthwhile to take a look at the Green Cultural State Minister and what she is promoted. I think if you are denouncing other people, and I think the spiral is at its end, nobody cares what you think anymore. So that it was actually Friedrich Merz. Here I'm calling back to my preceding speaker. It was Friedrich Merz, for example, who canceled that law, who voted against that one. It was actually Friedrich Merz and Jan Böhmermann who shared an opinion. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And even today, I cannot describe why a publisher who told me in so many emails that they were looking forward to my book. would cancel me before Christmas. I have no idea why that would happen. I don't want to indulge in conspiracy theories. I don't know if it was cold feet, but my suspicion is that some people told them, just don't do it. It's not good for you. And this fear is not just the fear of a publisher who is angry because cancel culture took place, because actually the book is selling like hotcakes thanks to cancel culture, but it's what makes all of us unfree. You're using expectations that are placed on you, and you are creating a buzzword performance, as we've already heard of. You're creating post-colonial fairy tales. I think that this fear leads to the feeling of Hotel Lux in the 30s in Moscow. It's the art that is bad. This is why the movies are terrible. This is why the Biennale and the documents that arise from it and the exhibits are the result of bad university papers. And I think this brokenness is something quite valuable, because it's not worth taking a close look at. I would tell you just to continue as you have. Continue with your repression. You have 1 more minute. If you don't want to talk about binary genders, because students will shout you down. I would like to thank you for the hate. I would like to thank you for the denunciation on the internet. I would like to thank you for all of your arrogance, because right-wing populism for the crowd has only proven me right. Thank you very much for everything you've done. Thank you very much for your hubris. As Claudia Roth has said, we listen and we judge. I think that she has described the left all too well. And actually, I wanted to come with a promise full of pathos. Please finish your sentence. Yes, it's coming. I'm getting to it. And I wanted to say that everything that I can do, I would ask you please to finish your sentence, because everybody enjoys the same rights. Just the one sentence. Quiet, please. I would like to destroy this, and I cannot. And I wish you all the best. I'm sure you do a much better job of that than I can. Thank you very much, Mr. Poschardt. Please take a seat.
So for the final speech, the final speech will be given by Ruth Wodak, and Robert Nieser is going to read out her presentation because unfortunately she had to cancel for health reasons. He's an author, he's a journalist, and we're happy to have him. Thank you very much. Now, I'm speaking on behalf of Ruth Wodak. I would like to share a couple of thoughts and theories. At a time when liberal democracies are under attack, many heated debates about exclusion and marginalization revolve around the term cancel culture. In other terms, people feel excluded and claim that they are no longer allowed to say what they want or even how they want to say it. Liberal and left-wing groups are particularly criticized as they are wrongly accused of having hegemony over the discourse. Polarization is what we see and also widely reported on in the media. People are getting worked up about gender-neutral language, about about certain identity issues and identity politics, about everything that is considered normal or not normal, about undefined common sense and what is not. To this end, it is important to first think about the functions of these debates and place them in a broader context. And I'm going to do so, Ruud, from my perspective as a discourse researcher and sociolinguist, and with the background of a recent lecture tour in the US in April 2025 and my experience I made there. Number one, these discussions are often symbolic politics. In other words, they deal with specific topics that rarely correlate with existential problems in our crisis-ridden times. In other words, the risk of poverty, the erosion of democratic institutions, increased willingness to resort to violence, and growing inequality. The question of whether I'm going to use asterisk or colons in text to indicate gender is actually just the tip of the iceberg and serves more to distract from important problems rather than to find meaningful solutions to them. It's like throwing a dead cat on the table, as this distraction is called. Two, the debate about woke and wokeness is similar, especially because the terms remain vague and blurred and are assigned different meanings. Ultimately, woke has become a battle cry of the right or rather, they use it to demonize inclusivity, diversity, and inclusive politics. Wokeness serves as a projection screen for all evil things, and it is no coincidence that in England there was even a ministry, it was called the Ministry of Common Sense, dedicated to fighting wokeness under the Tory government. That this often leads to extreme demands from marginalized groups such as LGBTQ+ is of course undeniable. The fight against wokeness encompasses many dimensions such as school and university curricula, participation, sports events, and important socio-political areas such as health and migration policies. Three, if one has a look at the history of these concepts, woke means awakened, and it referred to the emancipation movement of the black population in the US in the 1930s. And also, of course, the concept of political correctness, which initially referred to equal rights for minorities in educational institutions and is now used in different contexts of cancel cultures. In other words, who is allowed to say what, when, and where. Above all, it was important in the 1970s that minorities should no longer be referred to in a derogatory manner, but rather using the names they use themselves. Four, both terms are now used primarily in the US, but not only there, to silence critical voices and also voices from the margins of society. They frame a culture war against educational institutions and other institutions that deal with the agendas of minorities and women. Among other things, the aim is to change the educational agenda and budget priorities, such as cutting off development aid, such as US aid, and also promoting backward-looking fundamentalist movements and institutionalizing them as part of the mainstream. In the US, this began even before Donald Trump's inauguration on January 20, 2025 in Florida, with a ban on discussing certain topics in schools, using certain textbooks and teaching certain theories. For example, sex education. By the way, in Hungary, nothing about homosexuality can be taught at schools, and the theory of evolution is being questioned, and instead creationism is reinforced now. So-called dangerous books are being removed from libraries, not only those of the Pentagon, etc. Six, with Trump 2.0, this culture war has now taken on major proportions. And when I say this, I'm talking about a national sense of nationalism, chauvinism. Foreign students are sent back or no longer allowed into the US. So far, around 2,000 foreign students have been deported. No more entry visas are being issued, and no admission interviews are carried out at embassies, universities. that do not comply with those new rules, decrees, such as setting up a surveillance system designed to prevent critical teaching, will be punished. Students are literally kidnapped on campuses by so-called agents in plain clothes and deported on the basis of various accusations, sometimes even without making any accusations at all. Budgets are being slashed by millions and billions, which is particularly affecting research institutions such as Johns Hopkins University, also in climate research, pharmaceutical research, cancer research, etc. Children, for example, are no longer vaccinated, and the Department of Education has been closed down. So it's no longer about symbolic politics, wokeness, or political correctness, but about installing a retropia, if you will, backward-looking politics, about radically changing structures. And this is not only happening at elite universities, which are already viewed with skepticism in the US, but at all educational institutions. All of this means that MAGA will not succeed. So, Make America Great Again will not or cannot succeed, because not only will research and teaching be pushed out of the global elite, but many Trump voters, for example in healthcare, will also be hugely affected. The fact that medical research is tied to many hospitals and that budget cuts will also hit hospitals hard, especially in the red states, the conservative states, has not yet become widely known. The fact that children with measles have died in Texas is still seen as isolated cases. Well, I was able to experience many of those aspects myself during a recent lecture tour in the US. However, I have to state that I did not encounter any obstacles. However, I passed through immigration as an old lady in a wheelchair. I was neither questioned nor was my cell phone taken away. I gave 3 lectures at the State College in Pennsylvania. This is a huge state university with approximately 70,000 students, about a third of whom from abroad. I advised doctoral students who told me about their enormous fears. A Turkish student, for example, had her Fulbright scholarship cancelled from one day to the next. Chinese students no longer dare to go home during the summer because they fear that they may not be allowed to re-enter the country. The job market only offers few prospects, perspectives, and there are hardly any opportunities for young researchers, and much more. Overall, we can say there is a prevailing sense of fear. Fear dominates everyday life. Some people know this from totalitarian countries. Many court cases have been and are being lost by the Trump administration, but many people have not yet noticed this. A couple of remarks about the legal measures used by the Trump administration. The government mainly claimed that anti-Semitic protests are being targeted. These occurred mainly in 2024. This is an undisputed fact. There were also anti-Muslim incidents and also other forms of exclusions. And the existing polarization between Democrats and Republicans, between liberal and conservative, between the rich and the poor has been exacerbated by many measures, such as tax cuts and waves of layoffs. The legal scholar Michael Klarman of Harvard University listed many of Trump's statements in a recent lecture that can be classified as anti-Semitic. And there was no criticism from the Trump administration of Musk's raised arm, which resembled a Hitler salute. This makes the fight against anti-Semitism not credible. In its current form, this fight can therefore only be seen as a pretext for silencing critical voices. The aforementioned polarization caused by the culture war does not allow for objective debate, only an either-or approach. This polarization affects all positions, both on the left and on the right. Without a viable relationship, no objective discussion can succeed. This applies to the current political situation in the US, but also elsewhere, where certain highly emotionalized issues, such as the wars in Ukraine or Gaza. What is needed is not a yes-but discussion, but and also, in other words, differentiation, not a tunnel vision. That is what we need. What does not suit certain interests is cancelled. Sometimes this is not right for some, sometimes for others. It depends on who prevails. Freedom of expression is a human right and therefore a very precious commodity until it reaches its legal limits, such as in the case of the law banning national socialist activities, incitement to hatred, defamation, or discrimination of any kind. And these limits must, of course, be respected. But let me conclude by noting that we have to be willing to discuss and not discredit the other side in advance. Heuristic arguments, in other words, a destructive style of conversation, evade debates. Such conversations undermine liberal democracies, freedom of opinion and freedom of knowledge, and these also exist in our society and are directed against enlightened communities, and we must defend ourselves against such a cancel culture. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you, sir. Please take your seat. Thank you very much. Now, this concludes our meeting. We're going to come together tomorrow at 11 o'clock. We're going to hear our first case that is called Freedom of Expression or Incitement to Hatred, Cancelling, Polarization, and Freedom of Speech in the Face of the War in Gaza. Thank you very much.